Most people think silence means weakness, but in reality, silence is one of the most powerful psychological weapons human beings possess. Because the moment someone stops reacting emotionally, they become difficult to control. And in a world addicted to noise, calmness has become a form of power. Most people think power is loud. They think powerful people dominate conversations. They imagine confidence as constant talking, fast replies, strong opinions, the ability to always say something. But real psychological power often works in the exact opposite way. Because silence, when used correctly, changes the emotional balance of every interaction around you. And most people never realize it's happening. You've probably experienced this before without understanding why it affected you so deeply. A room becomes quiet after someone says something uncomfortable. A person stops replying during an argument. Someone listens to you without interrupting. Or a single pause appears in the middle of a conversation. And suddenly the entire emotional atmosphere changes. That is not accidental. Human beings are psychologically programmed to react to silence. Because silence creates uncertainty, and uncertainty forces the brain to search for meaning. The moment silence appears, people begin filling the empty space with their own thoughts, their own fears, their own assumptions, which means silence becomes a psychological mirror, and mirrors are powerful. This is why the quietest person in the room is sometimes the most emotionally dominant, not because they are superior, but because silence naturally creates attention. When someone talks constantly, their words begin losing weight. The brain adapts. It stops treating their voice as important. But silence interrupts expectation. And the human mind is extremely sensitive to interruptions, especially social ones. This is why pauses in speech can feel intense, even uncomfortable. Because the brain expects continuous emotional signals during communication. When those signals disappear, people instinctively become alert. They start analyzing, questioning, overthinking, and suddenly, the silent person controls the emotional rhythm of the interaction. This is one of the oldest forms of psychological influence in human behavior. Kings use silence. Interrogators use silence. Negotiators use silence. Even highly respected leaders often speak slower and less frequently than everyone around them. Because speaking less increases perceived value. The brain automatically assumes, if this person talks carefully, their words must matter. And whether people realize it consciously or not, they begin assigning authority to restraint. But modern society trains people to fear silence. Phones eliminate silence. Social media eliminates silence. Notifications eliminate silence. People now live inside constant stimulation, constant reactions, constant noise. And because of that, many individuals become deeply uncomfortable whenever silence appears. They rush to fill it immediately. They over-explain themselves, over-talk, overshare, not because they want to, but because silence forces them to confront emotional tension. And most people cannot tolerate emotional tension for long. That's why silence has become rare. And rare things naturally gain power. Think about the people who truly intimidate others psychologically. They are usually calm, measured, difficult to read, not emotionally explosive, not constantly reacting. Because emotional control creates unpredictability. And unpredictability creates psychological pressure. When someone reacts emotionally to everything, their behavior becomes easy to predict. People know how to manipulate them, how to trigger them, how to control the conversation. But silence interrupts that process completely. The less emotionally reactive you appear, the harder people find it to control you psychologically. That's why silence often feels powerful during conflict. Imagine two people arguing. One person becomes louder, faster, more emotional, trying desperately to dominate the interaction, but the other person remains calm, quiet, controlled. Suddenly, the emotional balance changes. Because emotional intensity without emotional reaction creates discomfort. The angry person unconsciously expects resistance. They expect emotional feedback, but silence denies them that reward. And the absence of emotional validation weakens their psychological position. This is why calm silence can completely destabilize emotionally aggressive people. Not through force, but through emotional contrast. And contrast shapes perception. But silence is not only powerful during conflict. It's powerful during attraction too. Some of the most magnetic people in the world speak very little. Because mystery increases attention. The human brain becomes obsessed with incomplete information. When someone reveals everything immediately, the brain finishes processing them quickly. Curiosity disappears, but silence delays certainty. And delayed certainty creates fascination. This is why emotionally intelligent people often pause before answering questions. Why confident people do not rush to explain themselves. Why psychologically strong individuals can sit comfortably in silence without panicking. Because they understand something most people never learn. The person who controls emotional pacing often controls the interaction itself. And silence controls pacing better than words ever can. But there's another reason silence feels powerful. It protects observation. Most people spend conversations preparing their next sentence. Not actually observing. Not listening. Not analyzing. They are too busy trying to be heard. But silent people notice everything. Tone changes. Body language. Eye movements. Emotional inconsistencies. Small behavioral shifts. And this creates another form of psychological advantage. Because people reveal themselves constantly when they think nobody is truly paying attention. The quiet observer often understands the room better than the loudest speaker ever will. This is why highly intelligent individuals sometimes appear emotionally distant in social situations. Not because they lack awareness, but because they are observing more than participating. And observation creates insight. But silence can also become dangerous. Because when silence comes from fear, it stops being power. True psychological silence is intentional. Not insecurity. Not emotional suppression. Not fear of speaking. There is a difference between controlled silence and silence created by weakness. One creates respect. The other creates invisibility. And understanding that difference changes everything. Because psychological power does not come from never speaking. It comes from knowing when silence is more effective than words. And most people never learn that balance. They spend their entire lives reacting immediately to everything around them, trying to defend themselves instantly, explain themselves instantly, prove themselves instantly, without realizing. Constant reaction slowly gives other people control over their emotional state. But silence interrupts emotional access. And emotional access is where psychological influence begins. The moment you stop reacting automatically, people start losing the ability to predict you. And prediction is deeply connected to control, which means silence, when mastered correctly, becomes far more than quietness. It becomes emotional discipline, psychological presence, and sometimes, in a world addicted to noise, silence becomes the loudest thing in the room. One of the strangest things about silence is that people often expose themselves around it. Not because they want to, but because human beings are uncomfortable with emotional uncertainty. And silence creates uncertainty faster than almost anything else. Imagine sitting with someone who does not instantly react. You tell them something emotional, personal, maybe even provocative. But instead of interrupting, instead of defending themselves, instead of rushing to respond, they simply look at you quietly. Immediately your brain starts working harder. You begin analyzing their expression, wondering what they think, whether they agree, whether they're judging you, whether you said too much. And without realizing it, you start revealing more information just to reduce your own discomfort. This happens constantly in human interaction. Silence pulls hidden emotions to the surface because the brain hates unfinished emotional patterns. This is why skilled interviewers use pauses, why negotiators stay quiet after making offers, why therapists allow silence to linger instead of constantly speaking. They understand something important. People often reveal the truth in the moments they try to escape silence. And this becomes even more powerful in modern society because most people are no longer mentally trained to tolerate stillness. Every moment of discomfort is instantly distracted away. Phones, videos, scrolling, messages, noise. People rarely sit alone with their own thoughts anymore, which means silence now feels psychologically heavier than ever before. For some people, even a few seconds of silence during conversation creates anxiety, and anxiety changes behavior. They begin over-talking, over-explaining, trying desperately to regain emotional certainty. But emotionally strong individuals behave differently. They do not rush to remove tension. They remain composed inside it, and that composure changes how people perceive them. Because calmness under emotional pressure signals psychological stability. The brain naturally associates emotional control with competence. This is one reason silence increases perceived confidence. Not because silence itself is magical, but because most people only remain calm when they feel secure internally. So, when someone speaks slowly, pauses naturally, and appears emotionally unaffected by social tension, others unconsciously assume this person must have control over themselves. And self-control is one of the most respected psychological traits in human behavior. But silence also changes something deeper. It changes status dynamics. In most conversations, people compete for attention without realizing it, interrupting, reacting quickly, trying to be interesting, trying to avoid being ignored. But the person who does not desperately seek attention often becomes the center of attention naturally, because emotional detachment creates gravity. Think about the people who appear socially powerful. They rarely seem desperate to impress others. They are comfortable allowing silence to exist, comfortable not constantly proving themselves. And that emotional independence changes the entire energy around them. Because desperation repels attention, but emotional restraint attracts curiosity. This is why silence becomes psychologically powerful during social interactions, especially in emotionally charged environments. A person who stays calm while everyone else becomes reactive immediately feels different, more grounded, more difficult to influence. And human beings instinctively notice emotional contrast. The calmer you remain, the louder everyone else appears emotionally. But silence is not about pretending to be cold. In fact, forced silence usually has the opposite effect. People can sense fake emotional control. They can feel when someone is staying quiet only to appear dominant. True psychological silence is natural, relaxed, intentional. It comes from internal confidence, not performance. And that difference matters. Because authentic silence creates presence. Fake silence creates awkwardness. Real emotional power does not come from acting mysterious. It comes from no longer needing constant validation from every interaction. That is what makes silence transformative psychologically. When you stop feeling the need to instantly defend yourself, justify yourself, or react emotionally to every situation, your entire social energy changes. People begin projecting strength onto you, even if you never asked for it. But silence also has another hidden effect. It protects your emotional energy. Most people lose enormous amounts of mental energy reacting to things that do not deserve reactions. Arguments online, negative comments, small social conflicts, passive-aggressive behavior, constant emotional noise. And over time, continuous reaction creates emotional exhaustion. But silence interrupts emotional consumption. Not every opinion deserves a response. Not every insult deserves attention. Not every misunderstanding requires explanation. Emotionally intelligent people understand this deeply. They know that attention itself is psychological currency. And where attention goes, energy follows. This is why emotionally mature individuals often appear quieter with age. Not because they become weak, but because they learn that reacting to everything slowly destroys inner stability. So instead of fighting every battle, they become selective, measured, controlled. And that selectiveness creates psychological weight, because restraint always feels more powerful than emotional impulsiveness. But perhaps the most powerful aspect of silence is what it reveals about yourself. Most people fear silence because silence removes distraction, and distraction protects people from uncomfortable thoughts. When life becomes quiet, people are forced to confront themselves, their insecurities, their loneliness, their fears, their unresolved emotions. This is why some individuals constantly surround themselves with noise, because silence becomes a mirror they cannot escape. But the people who learn to sit comfortably in silence often develop something rare, self-awareness. And self-awareness changes every human interaction afterward. Because once you understand your own emotions deeply, other people lose the ability to emotionally control you as easily. You stop reacting automatically. You stop chasing approval. You stop panicking during social tension. And slowly, silence stops feeling empty. It starts feeling peaceful, powerful, necessary. Because eventually you realize something most people spend their entire lives missing. The loudest person is not always the strongest. The most reactive person is not always the most confident. And sometimes, the people who say the least understand the most. There's a reason silence feels uncomfortable to so many people. Because silence removes performance. When conversation stops, when distractions disappear, people are left alone with themselves. And for many individuals, that becomes terrifying. Modern life teaches people how to stay distracted, but very few people learn how to stay emotionally still. That's why silence feels powerful, because it exposes emotional truth. Think about how quickly people react today. A message arrives. They respond instantly. An opinion appears online. They react instantly. Someone disagrees with them. They become emotional instantly. Modern society rewards speed, not reflection. But psychological strength is rarely fast. Real emotional control requires pause, awareness, restraint, and silence creates space for all three. Because when you stop reacting immediately, you begin seeing situations differently. You notice emotions before they control your behavior. You notice manipulation before it affects your decisions. You notice insecurity hiding behind aggression, fear hiding behind arrogance, loneliness hiding behind attention-seeking behavior. And slowly, the world becomes easier to understand psychologically, because silence sharpens observation. This is why emotionally intelligent people often appear calmer than others. Not because they feel less emotion, but because they understand emotion more deeply. They no longer allow every feeling to control their actions. And that ability changes everything, especially relationships. Most human conflict becomes worse because of impulsive emotional reactions. People speak while angry, defend themselves immediately, say things designed to wound each other emotionally, not because they truly want destruction, but because emotion temporarily overrides awareness. And once words are spoken, they cannot be taken back. But silence interrupts emotional escalation. A pause during conflict can completely change the outcome of an interaction, because silence creates time, and time weakens emotional intensity. This is why psychologically mature individuals do not always react immediately during arguments. They allow emotions to settle first. They understand that emotional control is more important than winning temporary moments. And ironically, this often gives them greater influence in the long term, because people trust emotional stability, not emotional chaos. But silence also changes how people value your presence. In modern culture, constant availability has become normal. Everyone is always reachable, always visible, always posting, always responding. And because of that, presence loses psychological weight. People begin taking attention for granted, but silence creates absence, and absence changes perception. When someone disappears emotionally for a while, people notice. They think about them more, analyze interactions more, replay conversations more, because the brain naturally values what becomes psychologically scarce. This is why silence can become emotionally powerful in relationships too. Not as manipulation, but because distance creates perspective. Many people never realize someone's emotional value until their presence becomes less available. And this applies beyond relationships. Even socially, people who constantly seek validation often lose influence over time because predictability weakens emotional impact. But people who remain selective with their words, their attention, their energy, often develop stronger psychological presence naturally, because restraint creates value, and value creates attention. But perhaps the deepest form of silence is internal silence, not external quietness. Internal quietness, the ability to remain mentally calm even when life becomes emotionally loud. Because the world constantly pulls at human attention. Fear, comparison, stress, noise, pressure, and without internal control, people become emotionally consumed by everything around them. But silence teaches emotional separation, the ability to observe thoughts without immediately obeying them, the ability to feel emotion without becoming controlled by emotion. And that may be one of the rarest psychological skills a person can develop today. Because most people are ruled by impulse, ruled by emotional stimulation, ruled by reaction. But silence creates consciousness between emotion and action. And inside that space, real psychological power begins forming. Not domination over other people, domination over yourself. And that is the difference most people misunderstand. True power was never about controlling others. It was about controlling your own emotional state when the world tries to control it for you. That's why silence feels different around certain people. You can sense stability inside them, presence, calmness, even when they say very little. Because emotional discipline changes energy. And human beings instinctively feel emotional energy whether they understand it consciously or not. This is why one calm person can completely change the atmosphere of an entire room. Why one emotionally controlled individual can make reactive people appear unstable instantly. Why one moment of silence can sometimes say more than 1,000 words ever could. Because silence carries emotional weight. And emotional weight shapes human perception. But silence should never become isolation. In a world addicted to noise, the rarest thing a person can become is truly calm. And sometimes, the quietest mind is the most powerful one in the room. And maybe that's the real reason silence feels so powerful. Because silence forces people to confront what noise usually hides. Their thoughts, their emotions, their insecurities, their need for validation. In a world where everyone is trying to be heard, the people who remain calm become impossible to ignore, because true psychological power was never about speaking the loudest. It was about mastering yourself while everyone else loses control around you. If you enjoyed this documentary, subscribe and turn on notifications for more deep psychological documentaries about human behavior, emotional intelligence, power, society, and the hidden patterns shaping modern life. And remember, sometimes the strongest person in the room is the one who no longer feels the need to prove it. This is important. Psychological strength is not emotional disconnection. It is emotional mastery. There is a difference. Some people stop speaking because they fear vulnerability. Others stop speaking because they no longer need constant validation. One comes from fear. The other comes from peace. And peace is powerful. Because peaceful people become difficult to manipulate, difficult to intimidate, difficult to emotionally destabilize. Not because they are emotionless, but because they understand themselves deeply enough to remain centered. And maybe that's the hidden truth behind silence. Maybe silence is not the absence of power. Maybe silence is what remains when a person no longer feels the need to prove they have it.